The cold that settled over the Hargrove house in November was not the kind that came from outside. It was already there when Vivienne woke up each morning, in the space between her side of the bed and Raymond's, in the way he set his coffee cup down without looking at her, in the particular silence that fell whenever she entered a room he was already in. She had learned, in 4 years of marriage, that silence could have texture. Raymond's silence was smooth and deliberate like polished stone. It did not invite. It did not apologize. She was 26 years old, and she had spent those 4 years convincing herself that this was simply what marriage looked like once the ceremony was over and the flowers had dried. The house itself was beautiful. That had never been in question. It sat at the end of Elmsworth Road in Halifax, a 3-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a kitchen garden that Vivienne had planted herself the spring after they married. She had planted sweet peas along the fence because she had read somewhere that they symbolized departure, not because she was planning anything, but because some quiet, stubborn part of her had chosen them anyway. Raymond Hargrove was 41. He had inherited his father's shipping business and his father's opinions about women, which were largely that they were decorative and ought to remain so. He was not violent. He was not drunk. He was simply thoroughly absent, present in body, and gone in every other way that mattered. When his colleagues came to dinner, he was charming. When his mother visited, he was attentive. When it was just the two of them, he read the newspaper at the table and spoke only to ask whether she had remembered to send the winter wool to his tailor. She had always remembered. They had married in 1868, when Vivienne was 22, and her father's tobacco business in Pictou County had run into the kind of debt that required a solution. Raymond Hargrove had been that solution. He was prosperous. He was established. Her father had shaken Raymond's hand and called it a good match, and Vivienne had stood in a cream-colored dress and said the words she was supposed to say, and told herself that fondness could grow where love had not been planted. It could not. She had tried in the early months. She had learned how he took his tea and which chair he preferred, and what topics made him bristle at the dinner table. She had hosted his business associates and smiled at their wives and listened to conversations she was not expected to contribute to. She had been, by every measure anyone around her would have used, a good wife, and she had slowly, quietly begun to disappear. It happened gradually, the way light fades in October. You don't notice until suddenly it is dark at 5 o'clock, and you cannot remember when it changed. She stopped mentioning the books she was reading because Raymond called them frivolous. She stopped suggesting they walk along the waterfront on Sundays because he found it cold. She stopped writing letters to her cousin in Montreal because Raymond said she spent too much time in correspondence that had nothing to do with the household. She was still writing them. She simply mailed them on Thursdays, when Raymond was at his office, slipping them into the postbox on her way back from the market. It was the smallest rebellion. It was the only one she had. Until the night of November the 14th, Raymond had invited 2 of his partners, Gordon Fitch and a man called Aldous Crane who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke about his wife the way one speaks about furniture, for brandy in the study after dinner. Vivienne had cleared the dining room, sent the cook home and gone upstairs, because that was the understood arrangement. The men would talk business. She would not be wanted. She had forgotten her embroidery hoop on the chair beside the study door. She came down the back stairs quietly, not wanting to interrupt, planning only to retrieve it and return to her room. The study door was not fully latched. A half-inch gap, nothing more. She reached for the embroidery hoop, and she heard Raymond's voice, loose with brandy and ease, saying her name. Vivienne. He said it the way one might say parlor curtains or the good china, referring to something owned. I'll grant you she runs the house without complaint. That's something, Fitch said. It's not nothing. Raymond paused. She could hear the clink of glass. But a man expects a bit more than efficient management. I married a housekeeper, it seems. Competent. Quiet. Another pause. Dull. The word landed in the hallway like something dropped from a great height. Crane laughed, a low, indulgent sound. At least she doesn't spend your money. Small mercies. Raymond's voice had settled into that familiar dry amusement, the tone he used when he was performing wit for an audience. I sometimes think she's more attached to that kitchen garden than she's ever been to me. Which tells you everything. More laughter. Comfortable. Unhurried. Vivienne stood in the dark hallway with the embroidery hoop in her hand and felt something shift in her chest. Not break exactly, because breaking implies something that was whole to begin with. It was more like the last thread giving way after a long, slow pulling. She had known, in some wordless and careful place in herself, that Raymond did not love her. She had not known he found her boring. She had not known he spoke of her this way to other men, with that particular lightness that comes from speaking about something that does not matter. She went back upstairs. She did not cry. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, her hands in her lap, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her. She thought about the 4 years. She thought about the sweet peas she had planted. She thought about her cousin Margaret's letters, which were full of a life that sounded like it had air in it. Margaret, who had moved to Montreal after her own husband passed, and had opened a millinery shop, and wrote with ink-stained fingers about the satisfaction of a thing that was entirely her own. And she thought about the letter she had received 6 months ago, the one from a solicitor in Amherst, Nova Scotia, telling her that her mother's aunt, a woman called Dorothea Price, whom Vivienne had met only twice as a child, had died and left her property. A modest house on 4 acres, the letter said. Vivienne had read it twice, placed it at the bottom of her writing desk drawer, and closed the drawer. It had seemed at the time like information that had arrived in the wrong life. She went to the writing desk and retrieved the letter. She read it again. 4 acres. A house. Hers, not Raymond's, not her father's, not belonging to any arrangement or obligation. Her mother's aunt had never married. The solicitor's letter mentioned this with a kind of matter-of-fact dignity, as though it were simply a fact about the woman rather than a judgment. Dorothea Price had lived alone on her property in Amherst for 31 years and had apparently done very well by it. Vivienne folded the letter and held it against her sternum for a moment, like a compass. Then she went to her wardrobe and began to pack. She took only what she had brought into the marriage: 2 dresses, her winter coat, her mother's brooch, the letters from Margaret, and the small amount of household money she kept in a tin in the back of the linen shelf, which came to $14.30. She had managed it carefully over 4 years, setting aside coins from the grocery money with the same quiet discipline she applied to everything in this house, without ever quite naming to herself what she was saving for. Perhaps she had always known. She was downstairs and out the kitchen door by 10 o'clock. The November air was sharp and clean and smelled of the sea. The men were still in the study. She could see the lamplight under the door. She did not look back at the house. She had tended it faithfully, and it had never once been hers. She walked to the end of Elmsworth Road and then south, toward the harbor. She had 5 miles to cover before she reached the boarding house on Barrington Street, where Margaret's old friend, a widow called Mrs. Sutton, kept rooms. Vivienne had never met Mrs. Sutton. She had only the address from one of Margaret's letters, copied into her own address book a year ago for reasons she had not examined too carefully. She examined them now, walking through the dark Halifax streets, and she found she was grateful for the part of herself that had quietly, stubbornly, been preparing. The walk took her just over an hour. Her feet ached by the time she reached Barrington Street. The boarding house was dark except for a lamp in the front window, and she stood on the step for a long moment before she knocked, aware that she was asking something large of a woman who did not know her. Mrs. Sutton answered the door in a dressing gown, holding a candle. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had decided long ago not to be surprised by much. She looked at Vivienne, coat buttoned to the throat, bag in hand, standing in the dark, and said, "Are you safe right now?" The simplicity of the question undid something in Vivienne's chest. "Yes," she said, "I'm safe. I just needed to leave." Mrs. N. Sutton looked at her for another moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in then. I'll put the kettle on." The room she was given was small and smelled of cedar and old books. Vivienne sat on the narrow bed and looked at her hands and tried to account for what she felt. Not relief, exactly, or not only that, something more complicated. The particular feeling of a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally set it down, and whose arms do not yet know what to do with themselves. In the morning, Mrs. Sutton made porridge and asked no questions that weren't practical. Did Vivienne have somewhere to go? Did she have money enough for the train? Was there anyone who would come looking for her in a way that would cause difficulty? Vivienne answered honestly. She had somewhere to go. She had enough money, barely, and Raymond, she paused here, sorting through it, Raymond would look, probably, not out of love but out of propriety. A wife who left was a public embarrassment. He would want her back for the same reason he'd wanted any number of things from her: appearance, management, the smooth running of surfaces. Mrs. Sutton nodded, practical as ever. "There's a train to Amherst at 7:30 Thursday morning," she said. "You should be on it, I know. Margaret wrote me about you," Mrs. Sutton said then, matter-of-factly, pouring more tea. "When you married Mr. Hargrove, she didn't think much of it." "Neither did I," Vivienne said, and it was the first honest thing she had said aloud about her marriage in 4 years. She spent 3 days at the boarding house. On the second day, Raymond came. She heard his voice downstairs, that particular tone of reasonable authority he used when he expected compliance. And she sat very still in her room and listened to Mrs. Sutton tell him without hesitation, that she had no guests fitting that description, and that she would thank him to get off her porch. After the front door closed, Vivienne let out a long breath. "Did he believe you?" she asked when Mrs. Sutton came back upstairs. "No," Mrs. Sutton said. "But he'll think about what it would look like to pursue it." She smoothed her apron. "Men like that always do." He did not come back. On Thursday morning, Vivienne took the train to Amherst. The solicitor, a brisk, decent man called Mr. Alderton, met her at his office and walked her through the paperwork with no particular curiosity about why she had waited 6 months or why she had arrived without her husband. The property transfer was straightforward. Her aunt had made the bequest in her own name, with no condition attached to marital status. The house was a mile outside of town, down a lane that had gone to mud in the November rain. Vivienne stood in front of it in her good boots, ruined by the end of the walk, and looked at it properly for the first time. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A story and a half, white clapboard gone slightly gray with weather, a stone chimney, a barn that needed work. The 4 acres were half cleared pasture and half woodlot, and the whole of it was quiet in a way that had nothing threatening in it. The front door key was on a hook inside the barn, where Mr. Alderton had said it would be. Vivienne found it, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The house was cold. It was also, she noticed this slowly as her eyes adjusted, entirely itself. Her aunt had furnished it simply and kept it well and left behind almost no clutter. There was a rocking chair by the window, a table, a shelf of books above the kitchen fireplace, a bed in the loft with a quilt that smelled of lavender and cedar as though it had been aired not long before. Vivienne built a fire. It took her 3 attempts because she had not built one herself in 4 years. There had always been a cook, a housemaid, a household arranged around her incapacity. She got the fire going on the 3rd try and crouched before it and held her cold hands out to it, and she thought about Dorothea Price, who had done this alone every winter for 31 years and had died, by all accounts, in reasonable peace. She thought, "I can do this." The thought did not feel small. Over the weeks that followed, she learned the house the way she had once tried to learn Raymond, attentively, without illusions. She learned which window let in the morning light first. She learned that the well needed a new rope. She learned that the nearest neighbor, a farmer called Mr. Beatty, who was about 70, and spoke mostly to his horse, would nonetheless appear at her gate, with a cord of firewood if it seemed she was running low, without needing to be asked or thanked. She learned that she was capable of more than she had been permitted to demonstrate. Her cousin Margaret arrived in December, having received Vivienne's letter, and apparently dropped everything on the basis of it. She arrived on the coach from Halifax with a carpet-bag and an expression of grim satisfaction, and she walked through the small house with her hands on her hips, inspecting corners, and then she sat at the kitchen table and said, "It just needs some attention." "I know," Vivienne said. "The barn could bring in income, a few chickens, a milk cow. You could take in sewing. There's a school in town that needs someone who can keep books." I heard it from Alderton's secretary. Margaret looked at her. "You managed an entire household budget for 4 years. You can manage this, I know," Vivienne said again. It still surprised her how clearly she knew it, now that someone was simply saying it directly. Margaret stayed 2 weeks. They worked through the cold days with something that wasn't quite cheerfulness but was close, the satisfaction of useful work in a space that belonged to no one's expectations. They rehung the barn door. They inventoried what the property had: good soil, a healthy woodlot, an apple orchard along the south fence that would produce come autumn. Margaret knew someone in Amherst who ran a small lending library and needed a part-time manager. She made introductions. By Christmas, Vivienne had a small income, a routine, and the beginning of a life that was her own in every particular. Raymond had written once, a letter that arrived forwarded through her father, as though her father was still an appropriate intermediary. The letter said that she had behaved irrationally and embarrassed him, that she was welcome to return and nothing more would be said about it, and that if she chose not to, she should understand that she was forfeiting every comfort and security she had enjoyed as his wife. The tone was the same one he used with junior employees: patient, firm, faintly contemptuous. She read it twice, then she set it in the fireplace and watched it go. She was not, she realized, angry at Raymond anymore. She had been, those first raw days, had walked through the bare pasture in the cold and felt the anger move through her like weather. But anger at Raymond required her to still believe that his opinion of her was the relevant one. She was finding, in the small daily accumulations of this new life, that it was not. What she felt instead, most days, was something quieter and more durable. The satisfaction of waking up in a house where the silence belonged to her. The particular pleasure of making a decision, any decision, even whether to have porridge or toast, without consulting what Raymond would prefer. The way time felt different when it was your own, fuller, and somehow slower, as though it had room in it. In February, she wrote to Margaret's friend who ran the lending library and accepted the position. She began walking into town 3 days a week and learned the names of the women who came in on Tuesday mornings, who tended to want novels, and the older men who came on Fridays for newspapers and history, and a girl of about 14 called Frances who came every Saturday and read everything and would talk about what she'd read to anyone who would listen. Vivienne listened. Frances reminded her a little of herself at that age, the particular hunger of someone who suspects the world is larger than the portion of it they've been allocated. She began setting aside books she thought Frances would like. She mentioned, carefully, that the ladies' reading circle at the Presbyterian Church met monthly and that some of the women there were very well read and would be worth knowing. Frances came to the next meeting and said something sharp and interesting about Agnes Strickland's Queens of England, and 3 of the older women looked at her with the particular attention that is given to someone who has just proved themselves worth noticing. Small things, but Vivienne had learned, this year, that small things accumulate. Spring came. The apple trees along the south fence bloomed, and Vivienne stood at the kitchen window on a morning in May and looked at them and felt something she had trouble naming. Not happiness exactly, which sounded too simple, but a kind of rightness, a sense of being at last inside her own life rather than the perimeter of someone else's. She had planted sweet peas along the fence of this house too, a different fence, a different house. She had bought the seeds in town in March, on an impulse, and pressed them into the cold soil, and she was watching now to see what they would become. She was 26 years old. She had $14.30, a house, 4 acres, a milk cow named Constance, 3 shelves of library books she was responsible for, and a girl named Frances who was going to read everything in the world if given half a chance. She picked up her pen and began the morning's letter to Margaret. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "the sweet peas are coming up.